Welcome to CAE Pilot Podcast, a podcast that brings together aviation professionals to discuss life as a pilot, training, and career advice. You can find us at cae.com/CAE Pilot-podcast or subscribe to our show on your audio podcasting platform of choice. You can also find our video podcast on our YouTube channel.
So welcome to this episode of the CAE Pilot Podcast. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome Matt Jones to the podcast. And Matt, you've done something very special. Why don't you tell us about it?
Yeah, so 2019, before the world, or particularly the aviation world, imploded, we were lucky enough to fly a Supermarine Spitfire around the world. It took us 4 months, never been done before. And based on what's happened since, I have to say, I find it almost difficult to believe we did it.
And the first question we always ask is about the one moment that stands out for you in your career. Does that moment come from this trip?
There were enormous number of very, very special moments in this trip, as I'm sure you can appreciate. And there were a couple of moments that were not so special, as you probably appreciate too. It's certainly as an event, it was, I don't think my aviation career will get any better. However, I did have the great honor of flying Wing Commander Tom Neal in 2015, when at Goodwood we held a 75th anniversary celebration or commemoration for the Battle of Britain, victory in the Battle of Britain. And Tom at the time was the greatest living survivor fighter pilot with 14 victories to his name. And to have him in the back of my two-seat Spitfire with 34 other fighters around us and leading that over the White Cliffs on a September day was, truly special. Our trip around the world was about sharing this aeroplane with lots of people, and I think we achieved that goal. But from a completely personal point of view, having that moment with him and being such a poignant moment in itself, but with such a key player, a member of the few. That was very, very special. So I hard push to beat that, I think.
He must have been full of stories, but let me ask you this. Was he giving you pointers on how to fly it when he was sitting behind you?
I did say to him the night before, Tom, you've survived the Battle of Britain and the whole of World War II, but you've got the most dangerous flight in your life coming up, and that's flying with me tomorrow. Which he half thought was funny and half thought was a proper warning, I think. I had, in fact, there's a lot of people that think I fluked one of the best landings I've ever done that day. And there's a lot of people that still don't believe it was me that landed it. They think he was on the controls in the back. And let's take it as 50-50.
Well, there's the right time, the right people, the right place can all come together to produce amazing things, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We were very lucky that day.
Tell me about your passion for the Spitfire, where that came from.
I think as a sort of, I'm in my mid to late 40s now, I think it's very difficult to grow up with parents who lived through the war or grandparents who were a part of the war, not to have some sort of interest in it, and certainly being or wanting to be a pilot since I was very young. I always knew what it was. Even as a 12-year-old, I remember there was a model shop in town, and I remember, it was around about the time I was allowed to walk into town on my own. I remember walking up the hill one day, and it had I can't remember the scale, but it was probably, 4 foot, 5 foot wingspan. And when you're 12, you're not that big, and that was huge. And it was a Spitfire in the window, and I thought, God, one day, wouldn't it be amazing if I got to have a go at that remote control Spitfire? Never really dreaming at that point that there might be a chance to fly the real thing. I think as a result, it's almost been passed down in folklore like a member of the family. And as a result, this country particularly, but I know very many other countries and Canada, of course, right up there, have an enormous fondness for the aircraft for exactly the same reason. And one of the things we found on our around the world trip, and one of the reasons for doing the trip was that, we are blessed here. We have quite a few Spitfires still flying, but many of the countries we flew in owe their freedom to that aircraft too, and the people that flew it. And very few of those countries have seen the aircraft since the war. So, there's a real opportunity just to let them see it. And I guess more than anything, let them hear it, because, it's the way it sounds is so special.
And what was the reaction of people when they'd see the airplane?
It was incredible. I mean, we had, numerous people come to see us with stories of parents and grandparents, and actually one in Kelowna springs to mind, whose father was he was actually a Lancaster pilot, but who based over in the UK, and just came really to hear the sound of the Merlin, of course, of which the Lancaster has four. And he told us a story about evading enemy fighters in a bomber, and it brought me to tears. And he was in tears himself. It sort of evoked memories in him of his parents, of his father, and that is what this aeroplane does for people. So there were an enormous number of exceptional reactions to it, and I can't think of any negative ones. They're all hugely positive.
Yeah, and it's amazing how certain things. I remember doing an event with Captain Gene Cernan. Sorry, he's the last man to walk on the moon, and there was a gentleman who came up to him after the event and was crying, and he said, I watched you from the beach as you took off that night, or whatever it was. And it's interesting how those emotions are so present even so many years later. So it must have been incredible for people to sort of, especially thinking of where many places have come since.
Yeah, absolutely right. Very rarely does people do fall in love with machinery, but very rarely does a piece of machinery have a sort of a purpose like the Spitfire had, and do its job so successfully, but at the same time exude unbelievable beauty in its form, and grace in the way it flies, married with just the sensational sound of the engine. There's so much so that kids who hear Spitfires fly past today, who are used to seeing and hearing aircraft all the time, even now it kind of piques their interest. Like, what is that? And it creates emotion in people that don't know its history. So it's a very it's an extremely emotive piece of engineering.
So how do you go from the kid, and I have this vision of you with your nose pressed up against the window of the model shop. Tell us a little bit about your career and how you ended up, doing this great trip.
Sure. I wanted to be a pilot since I was a kid, or since I was very, very young, and my dream was to join the Air Force. My eyesight wasn't up to it, and I kind of went off on a different path at that point. I thought, well, that's what I wanted to do, so if I can't do that, that's fine. Went to university, ended up working for a financial institution in the city, but sat at my window at my desk, looking out. I was very close to the flight line into Heathrow, thinking, what am I doing sat here every day? This isn't me. And so I started doing some flying training on the side, and ended up going to America for a year and a half, and doing a lot of air building and work as an instructor over there. Came back and got a job flying private jets and helicopters, and then got very lucky and just sort of met a guy who bought a two-seat Spitfire and said, "Hey, you should learn to fly this." Excuse me. he said a few other things at the time, and I didn't remember what they were because I was so blown away by the opening gambit. And in many ways, it's unfair because there are so many people who will sweep hanger floors for 15 years for the chance to, have a go in one. And I kind of very lucky that I, despite my passion for them at a fairly young age, I was able to have that opportunity.
And so what's your career look like now?
So it's Steve Brooks who owned the aircraft, and he and I set up Boltby Flight Academy, and that was just over 10 years ago now. And that was based around that 2C Spitfire. And initially we set up to train pilots to fly, because I found in my experience it was very difficult to find anyone who was prepared to teach me.
Mm-hmm.
Because there aren't that many people flying them, and there certainly aren't that many people flying them from the rear seat, which is an interesting experience in itself. And the holy grail really at the time was being able to take passengers up, because everyone wanted to have a go, but there was no regulatory mechanism by which we were able to do that. So we thought, well, I had a great time learning to fly. I'm sure there are other pilots who understand the risks of flying a non-ICAO, recognized aircraft, essentially a war machine,
mm-hmm.
who can understand the risk and would be prepared to pay for the experience of doing it. So we set up and had a great response from people, doing short courses or long courses and getting up to sort of solo standard. And in that time, built a relationship with the UK CAA to a point where they suggested we apply to take passengers flying, which, as I said, there was no mechanism for. So we asked them how we did it, and they said, "We don't know. We want you to work with us to make it possible." And that's what we did. And so in 2000 and good grief, I can't remember, 2015, maybe 2016, we got the first approval to be able to take passengers up, and then the business itself has boomed ever since, because there are so many people fascinated by this aircraft.
And I would think that a lot of the people who are going up in these aircraft are people who have a story or somehow connected to it, whether it be flying it, whether it be watching it fly overhead, etc. Is that the type of person that is typically your customer?
Yeah, there's a large, like I said, there's very few people of my age and older don't have a connection to World War II in some way through family members. So whether it's just a connection along the lines of, kids of my parents' age having a picture of a Jaguar up on the wall, Jaguar car, and thinking one day maybe, and then when they get to their 60s, 70s, having the disposable income to actually go and buy it. It's a very, so from at that level, right the way through to I'm flying with my dad's ashes, or I'm flying with my dad's medals, or my dad flew 14. This happened. My dad flew 49 different types of 49 different registrations of Spitfire. This will be his 50th. Will you sign his logbook? On the basis that we'd just flown his ashes around. So, everyone feels like they have a connection to the aircraft. The size of the connection differs, but there is, everyone really feels it.
So tell us about the genesis of the idea to, circumnavigate the globe with this thing.
So it comes from lots of different, like any idea, it comes from lots of different sources. Primarily, we as a business set up to continue the inspiration that this aircraft created 75, 80 years ago, and amazingly continues to do today, and to sort of spread that around the world. Now, the nuts and bolts of how that happened was we had one two-seater. We needed a second two-seater. We bought a very original and very complete single-seat Spitfire that hadn't flown since 1956, but that had been in a museum ever since. And so, unlike so many aircraft flying around today, it wasn't built from a data plate or similar.
Mm-hmm.
So we signed a contract, buy the aircraft, and then and have it restored as a two-seater. And it's the first airplane I'd ever owned, and it was a Spitfire. And I take you back to that looking in the shop window moment.
It's amazing.
And it didn't feel great.
It did not.
Bizarre. It didn't feel great. And I really kind of quizzed myself on why this was. A huge part of it was to do with the history. So this very intact, very complete Spitfire, we were going to take apart, cut bits out of, put back together for the benefit of our business and for the benefit of the pleasure of people flying. So it had a good cause. But, the more we looked into it, realized it had 51 combat missions. It had one success itself. This was a true flying piece of history. And to cut it up just didn't seem right. So I then took my godson to see Planes, the movie, and it was about flying around the world, and it was about Dusty, the crop hopper, or whatever it's called. And I saw how inspired my godson was to sort of watching this, and I thought, well, maybe we should be doing something like that. We're about inspiration, and it all kind of tied together at the same time. So I came out of there, and then I went up to Duxford and saw a different aircraft being restored, and I saw the wing in a jig unpainted, and thought, that's the most beautiful piece of engineering I've ever seen. And then I went back 3 weeks later, and it had been painted. And even though it was green and grey and had the roundel on, and it was a Spitfire wing, I was really slightly disappointed by it. And then I thought, well, maybe there's a few things happening here in my head. Maybe we shouldn't build this two-seater. Maybe we should keep it as a single-seater. Maybe we should fly it around the world and inspire kids and people generally. And maybe we shouldn't paint it. Maybe actually making it about the beauty of the engineering more than about the sort of war machine that it was the way to do it. And certainly that would ease our crossing of borders and the like, rather than flying under a sort of pseudo-military flag. So that's what we did. And, we stopped the contract as was and renegotiated to have it restored as was, which made the restoration company really happy themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And so our kind of following started, and so our planning started, and that was 2.5 years before we finally took off. And
then the journey itself was a 15-week adventure.
15, yeah, that's right. And it was a hell of an adventure. Now we're pilots, so we're not your kind of head out and go for it types. 2.5 years went in. The 2.5 years prior to flying went into, how do we make this aeroplane without changing it, or without ostensibly changing it? How do we make it as safe as possible for this trip? How do we make sure we've got all the permissions in place we need? How do we make sure that the fuel is in where we need it, etc., etc.? And all of those things together gave me a few sleepless nights. And in fact,
logistical nightmare.
Yeah, in fact, when we turned the Spitfire as an interceptor, it was designed for short range flight to create a wall around our country initially. And therefore it has very small fuel tanks, which is obviously a terrible thing when you're trying to fly. I think the longest leg we flew was 720 nautical miles. Now, standard fuel, it would have run out at 350 nautical miles. But we found wartime modifications that they used in photo reconnaissance Spitfires to add more fuel in all the different nooks and crannies that we could, and ended up taking a 85-gallon aeroplane to a 202-gallon aeroplane, which made a significant difference. And then we were able to slightly modify the carburetor to increase the fuel burn. And in fact, we used a Mustang carburetor, which has a which has a detent on the fuel cutoff lever, which allows you to, essentially lean the engine out a little bit. And all these little tweaks that we made, we had to put in a long range oil tank, have an ELT for certain places we went to. We had the fuel, so the way the fuel system works, we had a lot of fuel in the wings, and that fuel is fed by an air pressure source, and that air pressure source is the back of the vacuum pump, and the vacuum pump was 75 years old. So we could be in the middle of a sea crossing and have this old pump stop working, which would mean two things. One, some of our instruments would stop working, big deal with VFR. But secondly, we now can't get any of the fuel out of the wing tanks. So we got a modification and put a sort of backup pump in the line, and we're able to sort of monitor the pressure throughout, which, sounds like a small thing and an obvious thing here, but believe me, when you're sitting in that aeroplane at 5,000 feet above the Pacific, you really want to know exactly where your fuel is and how much you've got, and that you've got a pretty good redundancy if something goes wrong with the basic system. So that's what went into the aircraft. And then fuel is difficult. This airplane uses 100 low lead avgas. Unbeknownst to me, when I sort of conceived of the idea, GA doesn't really exist in a lot of countries around the world. I'm used to flying in the UK and Europe and the US, and GA, everyone does GA, so I just ignorantly presumed that it was the same everywhere,
right?
But it isn't, and as a result, there's no infrastructure in a lot of countries to provide avgas. So, for example, I'm waffling on a bit, but example, in Russia, there's literally no avgas anywhere near our route, and most of the places we stopped in, we were talking to a handler or sort of a guy there who was helping us and saying, well, why can't we just lorry it in? He goes, well, because there aren't any roads. The only way to get fuel there is by sea, and if you don't get it there in the summer, all the channels freeze, so then we can't even get boats in.
Wow.
Okay. So we had to pay for barrels, and so a year before we took off, I was having to plan exactly how many barrels we would need in each of the places we went to, and then work on the basis that with VFR we're flying 600 nautical miles on some of those legs. There's absolutely no information, no one to talk to tell us what the weather's going on. We've got predictive forecasting apps that help certainly, but then they're a long way from being 100%. There's a pretty good chance we're going to have to turn around on some of these legs and go back to where we started. But if we've only bought enough fuel to do the leg we've got planned, then we're going to be sat there until the river unfreezes, until we can get fuel back in again. So,
right.
Yeah. So then we thought, well, we've got a Pilatus, a PC-12 support aircraft, so we can put a bladder in that and fill that up. But you can't do that public transport, and some airfields won't allow you to do that, etc. So that had to be on the QT if we used it, and we didn't in the end. But anyway, so there's a lot of stuff that went into making sure the basics that we take for granted day in, day out in our GA flying were there for us.
So your support aircraft, give me an idea of what you carried with you. I mean, obviously this is not, if you can't find an FBO, finding a mechanic to work on these aircraft, even where there are some, can be a challenge, right?
Absolutely.
Like, how did you deal with that? What did you bring? You must have had a certain number of parts with you, or did you rely on FedEx to get you stuff? How did those logistics work?
So we took an engineer with us, of course, and the Spitfire's on a 25-hour maintenance cycle. So, and it's also really only approved to fly in UK airspace. So we had to get special dispensation for every country we went to allow the aircraft to fly in their airspace. In addition to that, we then had to prove to our CAA that we could do just as good a job on a 25-hour check in a foreign hangar that we could back at home. So we had to be very sort of specific in the places we were going to. And we had to have prior agreements with them that would have certain kinds of oil and bits and pieces sent over, and all the consumables that we would need was all sent ahead to each of those different places. And then we went through a sort of a process of, based on our experience of flying Spitfires, what are the bits that are most likely to fail and are carryable, and we will do our best to take those. And then for the bigger components, such as engine, prop, etc., we had those crated up back at home base, ready to go in case we had to get them somewhere. Now, there are some places we wouldn't have been able to get them to for months, but there are some places we probably could have gotten them to within, a couple of weeks.
So this was planned down to quite literally the second, in terms of fuel and in terms of every 25 hours. Like, you had to be in the right place every 25 hours, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So we had to put quite a bit of fat on the brake. So, rather than doing the checks every 25 hours, we did them every 20 hours to give us 5 hours of fudge in between. And then there's the opportunity to use an extension if necessary as well. So with that, we figured we should have enough. Again, based on the fact that it's VFR flight the whole way around the world, that weather does interrupt people's plans. So yeah, it was an enormous amount of planning went into that. But the Pilatus was a superb aircraft for that, and absolutely perfect for it.
That's
and particularly,
not the jet, is that the jet?
No, it's the PC-12 is the turbine one.
Okay, yeah.
So yeah, turboprop, sorry. But it also has a removable. The military one, the special ops one, has a removable plug door.
Mm-hmm.
So we hired a door to put on this Pilatus that we'd been lent, which was exceptional and amazing, because what it gave us. So one of the things we realised, one of the issues we had, was that there was no search and rescue for us in lots of places. So we were the only people. We were the only people that were going to look after us, certainly in the short term. So we had to have enough. The pilot, particularly on water crossings, but also over desert, jungle, alpine, etc. We had to have enough on us to last for a couple of days, and then we wanted capability of giving a longer duration than that. So on the Pilatus, we had a drop bag put together with flotation devices on it that had sort of shelter, food, water, enough to extend the 2 days to about nine days. And that included, basic things you probably wouldn't really think about, like mosquito spray, because you can have survived the whole thing and end up in, northern Canada. Jesus.
Well, you could either freeze to death in northern Canada, or in some other places, as you say, it's sort of like packing for
everything. And we wanted one pack, basically. So the Royal Air Force actually put a pack together for us. And
But during your ocean crossings, you must have found yourself in some crazy remote places. Like, I'm just thinking, you must have done all of Greenland, all of Iceland.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
so just to go back there to finishing off with the plug door, we sort of had this process where we could kind of throw the bag out and hope we got close with particularly in the water. It's really difficult unless you get a very, very close hit. But we also used it for photography and videography, which means we've been able to get a fantastic memory of the trip. And we've got a documentary that should be coming out in the next couple of months that Red Bull have ended up buying. So it will be one to look out for. We ended up going to 26 countries, I think, if you don't class Scotland as a country.
Which was the most memorable one for you?
So it's slightly like asking which is your favorite kid.
I wouldn't do that to you. Come
on. You mentioned Greenland earlier. Greenland was spectacular. Just the flying into Kulisuk, a gravel runway, icebergs and big mountains all around it, and then taking off out of there and then flying over this sort of ice cap for an hour and a half with these azure blue lakes on them that I've never seen before, in photos even. That was pretty spectacular, and that was a real sense of adventure, a real feeling of, bloody hell, I'm not sure anyone's done this before. And it really felt like we were on our way then. So that was very special. I think going into Russia, another very similar feeling. I've done a lot of flying in the US and in Canada before, and that felt very comfortable and very enjoyable. And particularly, obviously, the west coast of Canada was extremely.
It doesn't get much better than that, does it?
Yeah, that was stunning. But we knew we were friendly folk if something went wrong, and there's having that kind of, if I have to ditch here, I'm pretty sure there'll be a Canadian helicopter here pretty quickly coming looking for me. But when we crossed the border into Russia, you're like, not sure
that they're going to be so friendly.
Not sure they're going to be so friendly. They utterly were. What would have happened had we had an emergency of some sort? I've no idea. But actually, in the end, going through Russia worked very well, and we were very well helped by an organisation that tends to help sort of round the world people going through Russia, and they knew their stuff, and they made it happen for us very well. That feeling there of just being on your own, that there are no scars on the land. We were flying in between airports with no diverts, no options that were themselves suboptimal for use. One runway we landed on was made of metal. We landed on, which I'd never even heard of. It wasn't that the substructure was metal with something laid over the top. It was just metal lattice, which was a real bone shaker. So we were flying between places that were in themselves, interesting and odd, but in between, for 500 nautical miles, nothing. Absolutely nothing. No sign of human habitation whatsoever.
And isn't it amazing that there are still places like that? It's.
We flew for 4 or 5 days like that, just nothing. And then we'd land in a place, and there'd be 500 people live there. And then we took off again and flew for another 500 miles, and then landed somewhere else equally as small.
It's so different to the life we know now. It must have been such an amazing experience. And I know that when you came to the US, you landed in the Mojave Desert, and you ended up at the Virgin Galactic facilities. And so that must have been an interesting past and future moment, right? In terms of aviation.
Yeah, it was very cool, actually. We thoroughly enjoyed that meeting. Again, like everywhere we went, we were really well looked after. And seeing their adventure unwinding in front of us was very special. I have to say, actually, and I have no idea whether this is connected, but I'm taking credit. I saw the spaceship pushed out of the hangar about a week ago. When we saw it, it was white. It's now all polished silver. Just saying. Listen,
having been around green aircraft, having worked at a manufacturer and all that, there is an amazing industrial beauty to aircraft. Of course, when you talk about a Spitfire, it's a different story. But even if you take a modern jet today, and there's something about the rivets and the human aspect of it coming together that the paint sort of takes away.
Yeah, that's very true. Very, very true. And then in the case of this Spitfire, when the guys were restoring it, they're real perfectionists. So they'd say, "Hey, there's a big dent on the wing here," and I'd say, "Well, we want to completely replace that panel." I said, "Well, what's the dent from?" He goes, "Well, it's probably an engineer back in the day dropping a spanner." Oh, it's history. I don't want it removed. I want it left. So as a result, and they hated that initially, because they wanted for us, they want, and for themselves and for their pride, they wanted to create or restore something perfect, but that's not what we wanted. So the airplane from a distance looks utterly exquisite and perfect, and then when you get up close, you can see all these dents and dings and marks, and you can see panel works, and you can see replacement panels where it had a gear up landing, and one panel we think was flak, where 6 aircraft went out and only 3 came back on a really high flak when they were escorting bombers on a bombing run in 1944. And if they replace the panels, that history's gone forever. So, and in fact, on the right wing, someone has carved their initials. So when I first saw that, I was like, "That's too much." And then I thought, "I don't know. This they may have been done in the museum, which is part of history, but it may have been wartime too." So all of it is preserved and very visible. And like you say with the paint, and particularly with old aeroplanes, I found, like the wing I saw restored, when you take an aeroplane that is from the 1940s and it's 70 odd years old, and you cover it in 2021 paint, your head knows it's old, but your heart doesn't really believe it. It just looks too perfect.
It reminds me a little bit of, I don't know that it's a trend or not, but people who are restoring bar finds cars.
Yeah.
They're not repainting them. They're sealing in the rust and
exactly,
and all that. Just because, as you say, having the car be mechanically sound is one thing. I mean, I think you embrace technology or whatever you need to make that happen. But on the exterior, I'm a believer that everything has a story to it, right? And it's interesting to preserve that, especially on something as historic, really, as the aircraft you're talking about, the Spitfires.
Yeah, that's right. And then particularly, so I mentioned the wheels up landing. So there's a Norwegian pilot who was flying out of a place called Ford on the south coast, who had a wheels up landing at night. And when they took the airplane apart, they saw all the infield repairs that were made to because of that happened. They said, well, this frame we need to completely replace. I'm like, well, why? It flew for another 28 missions after that. Why does it need to be replaced now? Well, the rivet pattern on one side is straight and it's zigzag on the other. I'm like, brilliant.
That's even better.
Exactly. Who's going to tell the story about this guy if you remove that?
So you must know every inch of this airplane like the back of your hand.
Yeah, I know it pretty well.
It's funny. I was, when you speak to guys on the production lines and they look at airplanes that they've built and they're flying, they'll tell you about every rivet they've put into it. They know every little piece that they've done. It's really there's a huge source of pride, I think.
Yeah.
Whether it be on the production line or whether it be with restorers or yourself owning the aircraft, that I think it's really neat. You did this 15-week trip. Was the aircraft reliable?
Yeah, unbelievably so. I mean, we had a few gauge issues. We had a slight rumble that started quite worryingly on the leg between Taiwan and Hong Kong, so over some pretty tasty water. It was it was nothing worrying other than the fact that I mentioned, pilots, I think tend to presume the worst and hope for the best sort of thing, and plan and fly accordingly. So having flown these airplanes for a long time, I kind of 90% of me knew that it was just a plug issue or a mag issue, and it was just a sort of slight mistiming or even probably a fouling.
Right.
10% of me thought it's the start of the total cataclysmic destruction of the power plant in front of me. And it took us a while to find it. Actually, we landed in Hong Kong, which was you mentioned moments earlier. Landing a Spitfire at Chet Black Cock with 7 airliners waiting to take off, Cathay, and that was exceptional. Anyway, landed at Hong Kong, and our engineer got out and checked all the plugs and found one of them was indeed oil up. So he cleaned it, put it back together, ran it, no problem. And then the problem kept coming back. So I realized that it was something about that cylinder particularly. Thought it might have been a mag, so we changed the mag. Seemed better for a while, then it came back again, and it ended up, even though we'd had the harnesses tested again, ended up that there was a breakdown in one of the mag harnesses, the leads, and when we replaced that, it was better again. So that was the only one where we started thinking, God, this could be bad. Everything else was just we had an oil pressure gauge sticking and eventually failing, and an airspeed indicator failed, and a rad temperature gauge failed, and well, that's about it, really.
And what about your single longest leg on this journey?
So that was between Kuwait and Jordan. I think 730 nautical miles, pretty much all over the deserts, over Saudi Arabia, with the Iraqi border 5 miles to the north the whole way, which was interesting. Thoroughly enjoyable flight, actually, I have to say. You get a real sense of the scale of the planet when you go across one country, and it takes that period of time to do it. Not too slow a speed. I think I had a true airspeed of probably 210, 220 knots. And
how long is the flight for those of us?
Again?
For those of us who are nautical mile challenged, what would you say is the flying time?
The flying time
of that longest flight?
Oh, I see. Sorry, it was 3 hours and 30 minutes, I think. Just amazing expanse of desert, which was fascinating. And then going into Jordan, we flew over Wadi Rum, and then the sand goes really, really red, and felt like being in a Star Wars film. And I'd be lying if I said I didn't drop down below the Pilatus a little bit and go and explore some of the monoliths that exist around there.
Well, I'm just looking at the picture of you just over the pyramids in Egypt, I guess.
Yeah, that was the flight after that one. That was another incredible moment, and particularly because the Spitfire had such a huge influence in that arena around sort of Egypt, particularly. So to take it back there and fly over those things, which we talk about human design and longevity and beauty, and my God, the pyramids are all of those things. So sticking a Spitfire over the top and getting a photo of the two together was pretty cool.
Yeah, it's fair. I'm just looking at some of the pictures now. It's really amazing. Before we go, you're someone who's clearly living the dream in terms of aviation, and when you say it, you mean it. But COVID's I'm sure that amongst the pilot community where you are, there's many pilots waiting for their next ride. What words of encouragement would you have for them? I mean, you've really gone through the aviation industry. You've done different things before, finding this. What would you tell people who are just sitting there like waiting for their next flying job?
It's not been a smooth road at all. For starters, what I wanted to do was fly in the Air Force. As it happens, I don't think I'd have been very good at it. But that's what I wanted, and that didn't work for me, and I went off on a different path. And then eventually, like I said earlier, I thought, no, I'm going to do this. I'll be an airline pilot or similar, and just enjoy flying in that respect. But got my licenses, and literally within weeks of getting the piece of paper through the door saying I was good to go, I watched the two planes fly into the towers. Now, obviously, a lot of people suffered a hell of a lot worse than I did in that moment, in exactly the same way that a lot of people are suffering through COVID, in a way that's much tougher than not being able to fly for a while. But the market does come back, and we want to travel as a species. That is evident by the number of airplanes there are in the world, both airliners and small airplanes. I think it's just a case for me of counting your chickens and realizing that we're still lucky to be here and have your health, and that the days will come back, and they certainly did for me, and I'm sure they will for everyone else.
And I think the thing that I found interesting about your story is that you ended up, was it luck, was it timing that you met someone who had an interesting project and you ended up sort of where you are today?
I think it was a number of things. It was luck, it was timing, it was there are some people in life who could be lucky if only they could see the fact that they were having the opportunities. And I think as long as you keep your eyes open and look for the opportunities, then you at the end of your life could probably turn around and say, yeah, I was pretty lucky. I think there's a huge mindset there for seeing opportunity and seeing the glass as half full as opposed to half empty. So,
and I think those are great words to end on. But if people want to go and be inspired by your journey, where can they go check out your photos, and where can they get in touch with you?
So there's a couple of places. If you look at silverspitfire.com, that'll give you information about the trip we've done. There'll also be, we haven't updated it that much recently because we haven't been doing a great deal. But we're working on a book at the moment, and the documentary is now edited, cut, complete. So we're just waiting to hear from distributors as to when it'll air, and that information will be on there. Additionally, if you put spitfires.com into the internet, it'll take you to our business, which gives you the opportunity to live this dream a little yourself. We take people up flying in the Spitfire, and we do displays, and we have the world's only Spitfire simulator. Yeah, we built it out of many parts of original airplanes. So when you sit in this thing, you're in you're in a number of Spitfires essentially that flew in the war, and it sits in a 220 degree dome.
Nice.
So it's a cool experience. So we have lots of, we do lots of fun Spitfire stuff to try and keep the history and keep the memory alive. So if you fancy being part of that, it'd be great to see you down at Goodwood in the UK.
Well, next time I'm in the UK, I was there actually last February, 3 weeks before shutdown. Asked me how happy I was to just have traveled recently,
Yeah, right.
Yeah, but I'll for sure. My sister lives in London, so next time.
Come and see us.
You up for sure.
Come and see us, Patrick.
Yeah. Well, listen, thank you so much, Matt, for joining us. I think it's been really, really cool. And I'll just remind everyone that they can go check out. I just want to remind everybody to go check out Airside. And thanks again, Matt. Great
pleasure, Patrick. Thanks for your time too. And thanks for your interest.
Thanks.
CAE Pilot Podcast is brought to you by CAE, the global leader in training for the civil aviation, defense and security, and healthcare markets. For more information, check out cae.com.